it's an interesting topic today that we have to chat about, right?
Correct. The thing that makes it so interesting, though, is, when you look at ESG, a lot of people don't realize it's actually a very analytical and quantitative subject that's actually driven by frameworks. And what makes ESG investing so interesting is that it consumes a lot of data, but by adhering to frameworks, you also add a lot of data back into the ecosystem. So I think what we'll discuss today is let's look at ESG as a framework-driven science.
Yeah, I mean, that is a very different way to approaching a topic that's become very, very hot over the last, 2 or 3 years. As an investment team and as a team for that is relevant to personal consumption has become quite important for a lot of people. But the problem investors and consumers have had is trying to figure out how to use the information that's out there in order to help their decision-making processes. And in order to do that, we've had to shift away from being reliable entirely on the annual report that a company might publish, in which has a couple of hard data points that has taken months to extract from whatever company systems were available. Now that has changed quite dramatically in the last couple of years with a much more strong emphasis of getting, if not real time, at least close to real time information in terms of frequency of data, and also critically for me, I think the variety of data relating to ESG has basically exploded, right?
Literally a proliferation of data. You could even say it's a bit of an ESG data war that's going on. You've got multiple providers, each are trying to differentiate themselves in a crowded space. And I think this is why this ties in so nicely with this idea of ESG being framework driven, because ultimately you do need a set of standards whereby investors can make sense of the data that a manager has used to make decisions, of the data that a company has used in order to report. And it then also brings up a very interesting question about inequality that access to this data brings about. So when you look at, let's say, institutional investors versus retail investors, access to ESG data is probably skewed in favor of institutional investors. So we need to ask, how do we empower retail investors? And at the same time, when you look at the very large fund managers who may have the financial resources to subscribe to multiple points of data, build systems to filter through the data, etc., and then you look at the smaller fund managers that perhaps can't do that, it raises very interesting questions. Yes, it definitely solidifies the role of data, but I think it also starts to ask questions about democratization of ESG data. And are we creating another level of inequality between retail investors and institutional investors, and between big organizations and small organizations?
I think you have a very valid point there around the fact that access for information is something that will drive the ability to individuals and institutions to put in place the type of behavior that they would like based on some sort of fundamental beliefs around ESG criteria. But there's a couple of things you actually mentioned. The one that has been a focus, I think, from a regulatory and financial markets cooperation point of view, has been very much around putting in place a standard set of reporting frameworks. We've had for a while a competition between a couple of alternative ways of doing things, but we've now to the point where you have some that has been pretty much accepted everywhere, such as the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. That has become a de facto global standard. It comes with a certain requirements around data. At the same time, we've had some kind of progress on the front from kind of accounting point of view, where sustainability reporting is going to be part of the normal financial reporting process. That's a big shift from the point of view of companies that are required to provide the data. But I think you've picked up on something that invariably will become much more important for everyone, and that is, how do you get access to that information? The companies by and large will find a way to provide the information in one way or another, but how do investors and individual consumers get access to that type of information? Democratizing data it's a great headline, but how do you do that in practice? How do I, in my personal capacity, take into account my preferences when I make decisions?
I think it's a number of factors, Elena. I think on the one hand, you will probably need some forward-looking data providers that say, look, here's some base data that we've calculated that we're making available for free. And I think that has already happened to a certain extent. I think as corporates are required to put forward more detailed disclosures on their ESG position, then investors could go to their websites, like they do with annual reports. And if you want the annual report of a company, you go to the investor relations section on the website and you can get it for free. So I think ESG data and ESG disclosures, sustainability disclosures will go that way. I think we must also think about the accuracy of data. And if we're using data, which we will be, and we are, to make investment decisions, then we must also think about the accuracy of data, liability for accuracy, especially when you've got third-party providers. So you've got two funds, Fund A and Fund B. Fund A uses a certain ESG data provider, Fund B uses someone else. And let's say Fund B's data provider, doesn't have accurate data or has been negligent in some way in getting to their ratings, and Fund B acts on that. And it causes them to act in a fundamentally different manner to Fund A, which has had more accurate ratings, and Fund A does better. Where does the liability for that, for instance, sit? So I think with all of the disciplines in data science, such as AI, such as algorithms, etc., I think this question of liability over accuracy becomes quite important. And I think that's why you're seeing the global audit firms as well really beef up the ESG practices, because I think as you get engines and platforms that aggregate data from various sources, there will be a demand for that data to be externally verified, for some sort of quality stamp on that data to say that it's actually been translated accurately, that the processes for gathering the data are sound, and so forth.
Yeah, I think you have a great point about the fact of accuracy, because a lot of this is kind of still under development. There's a lot happening in terms of figuring out how to provide the information that investors require. There's clearly going to be missteps. And an audit trail of sense of the data is obviously something that will be very important to investors. But I think it also brings up another question, and that is, even if you verify the raw data, you still need to think about how to interpret it. And this is kind of in some ways taking us back to idea of frameworks and how do you manage and put in a kind of a straightforward better information that is so desperate. It comes from a variety of sources. They're not all that well organized yet. And that's why historically that's been significant amount of reliance on rating agencies of various kinds that provide that what you call the stamp of assurance. I think that's changing. I think what we are seeing now is much more demand for a customized approach, because my personal preferences and yours could differ, or the mandates we run could differ. So thematic driven investment means that I care probably more about a certain part of the vast data set. So how do we going to enable investors and consumers in some cases to get the information they want for their customized personal choice, rather than these big frameworks that apply to everyone at the same time?
So I think, Elena, you've hit the nail on the head. I think, as the ESG data industry matures, what we're clearly seeing now is a demand from asset managers and from investors as well to say, okay, now we've got sources of data. We've got some providers that have come up as perhaps being more credible than others. We've got the audit industry getting involved to start checking the accuracy of these providers. But we still have a problem, is that we've got various sources of data, and we need to somehow incorporate that. That data needs to speak to our investment philosophy. So every asset manager, every pension fund is required to have a responsible investment policy, an ESG policy, and that policy basically lays out how they view the world, what they're looking to achieve from the various asset classes, what's their economic mission, which parts of sustainability they're looking to influence, etc. And based on that, they need to act accordingly, because investors will look at that statement and say, okay, Fund A, we know you have a strong focus on infrastructure. Fund B, we know that carbon is definitely what you're looking at, and these are the reasons. So people look at the investment statement, and that gives them a sense of where the fund is at. But now the fund needs to use the data, which is often very generic across a number of different factors. They need to find a way to use that data to give effect to their policy. And where it gets difficult is where perhaps the data that you need for your specific policy isn't available in one place. So you may need to take a bit of data from provider A, a bit of data from provider B, and you may need to actually aggregate that in a way that makes sense, that takes the different methodologies into account, and also in a way that shows up as a single dashboard for your analysts and fund managers. And I think, Elena, this is going to give rise to the next wave in ESG data, which is what we could call data aggregation and analytics platforms, where their role is not the base collection of data, but their role is actually the input of data from providers and the customization of that data, the production of dashboards and views, and the integration of the different pieces of data.
I think this is a point that you've actually um, raised before in conception and idea, is that aggregation of data as a kind of specialized field is very much has to be driven by the ability to also customize my approach to a specific topic. And and these aggregator kind of model, a data aggregation model, does it bring the question of access? We that there's usually no such thing as a free lunch, as economists love to say. So how does one get access to that type of information? Because an institutional investor of a large size might be able to subscribe, but it's not going to be the case for everyone. And we're back to the same problem we had where the access to data becomes difficult. There's inequality that will impact investment decisions.
Absolutely. I think for the large managers, they can afford to build this tool in house and perhaps have 10 or 15 different subscriptions to different data providers. For the smaller managers, and perhaps even for retail investors, what you need is a provider, someone that sees a business opportunity and says, fine, we'll pay those subscriptions and we'll centralize that data and we'll build analytics and tools on top of that that you can manipulate to get your view out. And what we'll charge you will actually be a lot less than what you'd pay for all of those elements combined. And I think that's what we're seeing in the market as well. As our organizations launched ESG Go and ESG Now, which are platforms that do exactly that. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot more of that in the market as well. And I'm sure we're going to see a lot of open source initiatives going forward as well. I know in the US, Microsoft is definitely looking at open source climate data. So I think you're going to see a lot of these analytics platforms. I can definitely see AI coming into here as well for predictive scores. And you're going to get a lot more intermediaries between the raw data providers and the end users, but intermediaries that add value and that add processing at each stage. So it's almost going to be beneficiation of the raw data that's going to start building up over time. And hopefully, as that becomes more generic, to your point, Elena, it can be at a cost that the retail investor can access, or perhaps it becomes so commoditized that there's a core piece of that data that's open source for the retail investor.
Thanks. I think that's probably a really important point to emphasize, is that as the market continues to develop, and I'm not talking just the ESG investment market, but also the data market for ESG related data, we're going to see that shift towards a basically kind of almost a Rubik Cube approach. You take various bits, you put them together, you line them up to suit your particular request for information, depending on what the team is that you want to actually put into either your investment process as a institutional investor or as a person.
Absolutely. But that's a lot more complex sometimes than it seems. Because as the old saying goes, you must compare apples with apples, and you have to add similar things. So you can't add different variables or quantities with different units of measurement. So you really do need to understand this score that I'm getting from provider A. What was the basis upon which it was calculated? The score that I'm getting provider B. What was the basis? So, for instance, we've done an exercise internally where we've looked at various data providers and we've seen some of them are fact-based, some of them perhaps lean more on opinion basis. We've come across a really good provider whose data is almost entirely gleaned from the information that the company puts out versus, let's say, another provider that looks at what the total third-party ecosystem is saying. So you need to understand those things. So if you have one data provider that is really fact-based, looking through documents, and you've got another one that has a bit of predictive analytics and a bit of subjectivity in it. Not to say one is better than the other, but when you're combining the two, you must be aware that if someone asks you, your overall view, your data, is it really fact-based, evidence-based data? Is it predictive? You've now got an issue because you've got a mix of data. So you need to, which is not a problem, but you need to explain how you've mixed it and why the two are actually fungible with each other. So it goes beyond a mere number crunching. You need a deep understanding of the methodology, which means either you get external experts to do that for you, or you have the internal resources, or there's these aggregation platforms that we spoke about who have the expertise to do that, do all of that in the background, and just show you results in your dashboard where you're confident that when something appears in your dashboard that speaks to your policy, all of these factors have been taken into account.
Okay, thanks. And I think maybe that's I'm aware we are almost out of time, so I think it's probably a good point to leave this at, and just to emphasize that the field of ESG data provision has changed dramatically, and we are on probably in the brink of another big step, the move away from just looking at raw data or curated data towards accessing a variety of data, but aggregated in a way that serves your particular needs as an investor or a consumer.
This idea of alternative data is not something that's new. The asset management industry has for a while been looking at what's the value of alternate data. Can it unlock advantages for managers that have access or look at different types of data? And I think this rise in ESG and the prominence of ESG has just accelerated that trend because it really is so dependent on data. And as you have generic sources of data, it then becomes, like you said, about the customization of their data. And if one has to look a step forward, it's probably also now going to go into the alternative data space, which is to say, which other data sets can we use to give us that rare insight that's going to distinguish us from our competitors?